The dust had not yet settled on the trading post corral when Rebecca Maddox realized her father had just sold her to a stranger for a bull worth more than her own life. It was the spring of 1878, in the dry hill country outside Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, and the sun hung low and orange over the split-rail fences of Colton's trading post. Rebecca stood with her hands folded in front of her faded blue calico dress, her chestnut hair pulled back tight beneath a bonnet that had seen better years, and she watched as her father, Elias Maddox, shook hands with a man named Horace Prout. "She cooks fine, sews finer, and she has never once given me trouble," Elias said, as though he were describing a milking cow rather than his own daughter. "You will not find a more obedient wife in the whole territory, Mr. Prout." Horace Prout was a broad, thick-necked man of perhaps 50 years, with tobacco-stained teeth and small eyes that moved over Rebecca the way a man might examine a horse he intended to buy at auction. He wore a black coat too fine for the dust of the corral, and a diamond stickpin glittered at his throat, an ostentation that seemed almost cruel against the poverty of the Maddox homestead. "She is comely enough," Prout said. "Turn around, girl." Rebecca did not move. Her jaw tightened and something hot and furious rose in her chest, but she had learned long ago that defiance only earned her father's belt, and so she stood still, staring at a point somewhere past Prout's shoulder, refusing to meet his eyes. "Rebecca," her father said, a warning in his voice. She turned slowly, her back straight, her chin lifted. She would not cower. Whatever indignity was about to be visited upon her, she would not give either man the satisfaction of seeing her break. "She will do," Prout said at last. "I have here the papers, and the bull as agreed." He gestured toward the corral, where a massive red Hereford bull stood chewing lazily at a pile of hay, oblivious to the fact that it had just been exchanged for a human life. The animal was, Rebecca had to admit even in her fury, a magnificent creature, easily worth $800 to a rancher who wanted to improve his herd. Her father's small spread had been failing for 3 years, the cattle thin and the well running low, and Elias Maddox had apparently decided that a daughter of 20 years was worth less to him than the promise of fat calves come autumn. "You cannot do this," Rebecca said, finally finding her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Father, I am not livestock. You cannot simply trade me." "It is done, Rebecca," Elias said, not looking at her. "Mr. Prout has agreed to marry you proper, with a preacher and all. You will have a house and food, and you will want for nothing. It is more than I can give you here." "I do not want a house bought with my own sale," Rebecca said, her voice rising now, cracking with the strain of holding back tears she refused to let fall in front of these men. "I want to choose my own husband as any free woman should." Prout laughed, a low, unpleasant sound. "Free woman. There is no such thing out here, girl, not for a woman without money or family standing. You ought to be grateful. I could have had my pick of any number of women desperate enough to answer an advertisement, and instead your father has offered me something better, someone bred and raised right here in this territory, who knows the ways of a homestead. Do not mistake my generosity for weakness." It was at that moment, as Rebecca stood trembling between fury and despair, that a rider came up the trail from the east, his horse kicking up a trail of dust that caught the last light of the afternoon sun. Joseph Ralston had not meant to arrive at Colton's trading post at that particular hour. He had come only to purchase salt and cartridges before returning to the Circle R, the modest but well-tended ranch he had built with his own 2 hands over the past 6 years. Ever since he had mustered out from a stint driving cattle up from Texas, and decided that Wyoming Territory, with its high grass and clean rivers, was where he wanted to plant himself for good. He was 28 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard land, with sun-browned skin, dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat, and gray eyes that had seen enough of the world to know cruelty when it stood before him plain as day. He reined his horse in at the edge of the corral and dismounted, and it was then that he heard the tail end of Prute's words and saw the papers in Maddox's hand, and understood in an instant what manner of transaction was taking place. "What is going on here?" Joseph asked, though his tone made clear he had already guessed. "Nothing that concerns you, Cowboy," Prute said, barely glancing at him. "This is a private family matter." "A man does not sell his daughter for a bull and call it a family matter," Joseph said. He looked at Rebecca then, truly looked at her, and saw not the obedient, biddable creature Elias had described, but a young woman with fire in her hazel eyes even as tears threatened at their corners, a woman who stood tall despite everything conspiring to bend her. "It is a marriage contract," Elias said defensively, though he could not quite meet Joseph's gaze either. "Mr. Prute has agreed to wed her proper. There is nothing unlawful in it." "Unlawful is one thing," Joseph said. "Decent is another." He stepped closer, and Rebecca found herself holding her breath, though she could not have said why this stranger's arrival stirred something in her chest that felt dangerously close to hope. "Miss, is this truly your wish? To marry this man?" Rebecca opened her mouth, and for a moment no words came. She looked at her father, who would not meet her eyes, and at Prute, whose small eyes had narrowed with the first stirrings of anger at being questioned. And then she looked at this stranger, this cowboy with the steady gray eyes, who was the first person in her 20 years to ask her what she wanted rather than simply telling her what she would do. "No," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "It is not my wish. It has never been asked of me until this very moment." "There," Joseph said, turning back to Elias and Prute, "the lady has spoken." "The lady has no say in the matter," Prute snapped, his composure cracking now. "This is a legal contract between her father and myself. Who in the hell are you to interfere, Mr. Joseph Ralston," Joseph said, "of the Circle R out past the Laramie Fork, and I am a man who cannot stand by and watch a woman traded like cattle, contract or no contract." Maddox, sensing the situation slipping from his control, tried to salvage what he could. "Mr. Ralston, I understand your concern, but this is truly none of your business. The bull is already delivered. The papers are signed." "Then I will make it my business," Joseph said, and before anyone could stop him, he strode past Prute, snatched the papers from Maddox's hand and tore them clean in half, then in half again, letting the pieces scatter in the dust at Prute's polished boots. For a moment, no one spoke. Prute's face had gone a mottled shade of red, and his hand twitched toward the pistol at his hip, though he seemed to think better of drawing it against a man who stood a full head taller and looked entirely unafraid of the prospect of violence. "You will pay for that, Ralston," Prute said, his voice low and dangerous. "That bull cost me $800, and I intend to see this contract honored one way or another." "The bull is yours," Joseph said. "Keep it. But the woman is not property to be exchanged, and any judge in this territory would say the same, contract or not. You cannot legally sell a human being, Prute, not since the war, not anywhere in these United States." Prute's jaw worked, but he seemed to recognize the truth in Joseph's words, or perhaps simply the futility of arguing further with a man who had already destroyed the physical evidence of their agreement. He turned instead to Maddox, his fury redirected. "You will return my bull, Maddox, or I will have the sheriff out here within the week." "The bull was a gift freely given, as agreed between us," Elias said weakly. "I cannot simply—" "You can and you will," Prute said, "or you can explain to the sheriff how you attempted to sell your own daughter into marriage against her will, which I imagine would not sit well even in a territory as forgiving as this one." With that threat hanging in the air, Prute turned on his heel, remounted his horse, which had been tied near the trading post's hitching rail, and rode off in a fury, leaving behind only the settling dust and the torn scraps of paper that had, moments before, constituted the sale of a woman's future. Maddox stood staring after him, his face pale, clearly calculating the loss of the bull and what it would mean for his struggling homestead. Rebecca, for her part, could hardly believe what had just transpired. She looked at Joseph Ralston, this stranger who had appeared out of the dust like something from a dime novel, and found she did not know whether to thank him or weep. "You should not have done that," Elias said to Joseph, though there was less anger in his voice now than exhaustion. "That bull would have seen us through the winter. Now what am I to do?" "You are to let your daughter live her own life," Joseph said, though not unkindly. "There are other ways to save a homestead than selling your own blood, Mr. Maddox." "Easy words from a man with a ranch already built," Elias said bitterly. "You do not know what it is to watch your cattle starve, to watch the well run dry, to have nothing left to offer a daughter but the hope that some man with means might take her off your hands and give her a life you cannot." Rebecca, who had remained silent through this exchange, finally found her voice. "Father, I would rather starve beside you than be sold to a man like Horace Prout. Did you truly believe I would thank you for this?" Elias could not answer. He simply shook his head, mounted his own tired horse, and rode off toward the small homestead he shared with his daughter, leaving Rebecca standing alone in the corral with a stranger who had just upended everything. "Miss Maddox," Joseph said gently, once her father had gone, "I did not mean to cause trouble between you and your father. I only could not stand to see what was happening." "You have nothing to apologize for," Rebecca said, and now that the danger had passed, she found herself trembling, the full weight of what had almost happened crashing down upon her. "I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Ralston. I do not know what I would have done." "You do not need to thank me," Joseph said. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Not every man is decent," Rebecca said quietly, thinking of Prout's cold, appraising eyes. "I have learned that much in 20 years. Joseph studied her for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion in her face, the pride that still held her shoulders straight despite everything, the intelligence in her hazel eyes that spoke of a woman far more capable than her father had given her credit for. "Do you have somewhere safe to go tonight?" he asked. "I do not like the thought of you returning to your father's homestead, not with Prout's threats still hanging over things. A man like that does not take well to being crossed, and I fear he may try to claim what he believes is owed to him one way or another." Rebecca had not considered this, but now that Joseph mentioned it, a cold fear settled in her stomach. Prout had seemed the sort of man who did not easily let go of a grievance, and her father's homestead was isolated, miles from the nearest town, with no one to protect her should Prout decide to return in the night. "I have nowhere else to go," Rebecca admitted. "My mother passed 3 years ago, and I have no other family in the territory." Joseph was quiet for a moment, weighing something in his mind. Then he said, "I have a proposition for you, Miss Maddox, and I hope you will not think me forward for offering it so soon after we have met, but I believe it may solve both our troubles." Rebecca looked at him warily. "What sort of proposition?" "Marriage," Joseph said simply. "Not the sort your father and Prout arranged, not a trade or a contract signed without your consent. I am asking you plainly, as one person to another, whether you might consider becoming my wife. I have a ranch, modest but sound, and I am in need of a partner to help it grow. I would not ask you to love me right away, nor even to trust me fully so soon. But I would treat you with respect, and I would never think to trade you for cattle or anything else." For a long moment, Rebecca could not speak. The events of the day had moved so swiftly, from the horror of being bartered like livestock to this strange and sudden proposal from a man she had known for perhaps 20 minutes, that she hardly knew how to react. "You barely know me," she said at last. "Why would you offer such a thing?" "Because I saw how you stood there, refusing to bend even when everyone around you expected you to break," Joseph said. "And because I know what it is to want a partner in life who is chosen freely, not forced. I have been alone on that ranch for 6 years, Miss Maddox, and I confess I have grown tired of the solitude. I am not asking for your love today. I am asking only for the chance to earn it, if you will give me that chance." Rebecca looked out at the darkening sky, at the trail leading back toward her father's failing homestead, and thought of Horace Prout's cold eyes and the diamond stickpin that had glittered like something predatory at his throat. She thought of the years stretching ahead of her, either trapped in her father's poverty or hand it off to whatever man he next decided might solve his financial troubles. "If I agree," she said slowly, "it would be a marriage of convenience only. I would expect to be treated as a partner, not a possession. I would expect honesty and respect and the freedom to make my own choices in matters that concern our home." "You would have all of that," Joseph said, "and my word on it. And if in time we found we could not suit each other," Rebecca continued, "what then?" "Then we would speak honestly of it," Joseph said, "and find whatever solution seemed right between us. I would not trap you in misery, Miss Maddox. That much I can promise." Rebecca studied his face in the fading light, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the calculating cruelty she had seen in Pruett's eyes. She found none. Instead, she found something steady and true, a man who had risked confrontation with an armed stranger simply because he could not stomach injustice. "Then I accept," she said, "on those terms." Joseph felt something loosen in his chest, a relief he had not expected to feel so strongly. "Thank you," he said. "I promise you will not regret this decision, Miss Maddox." "Rebecca," she said, "if we are to be married, you had better call me Rebecca." "Rebecca," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name, careful and warm, made her believe, for the first time that day, that perhaps everything might yet turn out well. They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher named Reverend Abel Whitfield, who traveled through the territory holding services and performing ceremonies wherever they were needed. The wedding was small, held in the front room of the Circle R ranch house, attended only by Joseph's ranch hand, an older man named Samuel Coates who had worked cattle with Joseph since the ranch's founding, and by Rebecca's father, Elias, who had come despite the tension still lingering between him and his daughter, and despite his continued anxiety over what might come of Pruett's threats regarding the bull. Rebecca wore a simple dress of pale yellow cotton, the best she owned, and Joseph wore his good shirt and a string tie he had borrowed from Samuel. And when Reverend Whitfield asked if she would take Joseph Ralston as her lawful husband, Rebecca found that her voice did not tremble at all when she said yes, though her heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and something she could not quite name, something that felt almost like anticipation. After the ceremony, Elias lingered near the door, clearly uncertain of his welcome. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I know I have wronged you. I will not ask your forgiveness today, for I do not deserve it yet. But I hope, in time, you might find it in your heart to visit, once the wound has healed some." Rebecca looked at her father for a long moment, weighing the anger she still felt against the memory of better days before her mother's death, when Elias had been a kinder, gentler man, worn down since then by grief and failing crops and the slow erosion of hope that came with a dying homestead. "I will visit, father," she said finally, "when I am ready, but do not expect me to forget what almost happened." "I would not ask you to forget," Elias said, "only perhaps to forgive someday." He left soon after, riding back toward his homestead alone, and Rebecca watched him go with a complicated ache in her chest, grief and anger tangled together in a way she suspected would take years to fully unravel. That evening, as the sun set over the rolling grasslands surrounding the Circle R, Joseph found Rebecca standing on the small porch of the ranch house, looking out at the herd of cattle grazing in the distance, their shapes dark against the amber sky. "It is a fine spread," Rebecca said when he came to stand beside her. "You have built this yourself." "With Samuel's help and a few hired hands during roundup season," Joseph said. "But yes, mostly with my own hands. I came up from Texas 6 years ago, drove cattle north with an outfit heading to the railheads, and when I saw this land I knew I wanted to stay. Bought the initial acreage with my savings from 3 years of driving and built from there." "It is beautiful," Rebecca said, and meant it. There was something peaceful about the wide expanse of grass, the distant mountains catching the last light of day, the quiet lowing of cattle settling in for the night. "I am glad you think so," Joseph said. "I would like for you to feel this is truly your home, Rebecca, not merely a place you have been brought to out of necessity." "I am trying," she said honestly. It is strange being married to a man I have known only a handful of days. I do not yet know your habits, your temper, the things that bring you joy or sorrow. We have time to learn all of that, Joseph said. I do not expect everything at once. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky, and Rebecca found herself thinking that perhaps, despite the strange and frightening way this marriage had come to be, she had landed in far better circumstances than she had any right to expect. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that surprised Rebecca with its gentleness. Joseph rose before dawn each day to tend the cattle, checking fences, driving the herd to fresh grazing ground, and working alongside Samuel Coates on the endless tasks that kept a ranch running. Rebecca, for her part, took to managing the house with an efficiency that impressed even herself, given how little practice she had truly had at running a household of her own rather than simply assisting her mother. She cooked meals that grew steadily better as she learned Joseph's preferences, mended clothes and darned socks in the evenings by lamplight, and tended a small garden she had begun behind the house, planting vegetables that would help stretch their supplies through the coming winter. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, she and Joseph would often sit together on the porch, talking of small things at first, the weather, the state of the herd, news from town when Samuel returned from supply runs, but gradually their conversations deepened into something more personal. "Tell me of your family," Rebecca said one evening, several weeks into their marriage, as they sat together watching fireflies begin to emerge in the tall grass beyond the porch. Joseph was quiet for a moment before answering. "My mother passed when I was 12, fever that took half our county that summer. My father raised me and my younger sister alone after that, on a small farm in East Texas. He was a hard man but not unkind, not like your father seems to have become, if you will forgive me saying so." "You may say so," Rebecca said. "I have no illusions about what my father did." "My father died when I was 20, Joseph continued. "Heart failed him suddenly, out in the fields. My sister had already married by then, moved to Louisiana with her husband, and I found myself with no reason to stay in Texas. That was when I joined a cattle drive heading north, thinking I might see something of the world before settling down." "And you found Wyoming Territory instead," Rebecca said. "I found Wyoming Territory," Joseph agreed, "and decided it suited me better than anywhere I had been before. The land here, it has a kind of honesty to it. Hard, certainly, unforgiving in winter, but honest. You put in the work and the land gives back more often than not." "I think I am beginning to understand that," Rebecca said, thinking of her small garden, the vegetables slowly growing despite the challenges of the dry Wyoming soil. "And your mother?" Joseph asked gently. "You mentioned she passed 3 years ago." Rebecca's face grew somber. "Consumption," she said. "It took her slowly over the better part of a year. My father was never the same after that. He had loved her fiercely in his own quiet way, and when she died, something in him seemed to die as well. The homestead began failing not long after, though I do not know if that was due to his grief or simply bad luck with the weather and the cattle prices." "I am sorry," Joseph said. "That must have been difficult watching him change so." "It was," Rebecca said. "I do not excuse what he did, offering me to Prout as though I were nothing more than property. But I understand, perhaps, the desperation that drove him to it. He saw no other way to save what remained of our home, and in his grief and fear he made a terrible choice." "Do you think you will forgive him?" Joseph asked. "In time, perhaps," Rebecca said. "I do not know yet, but I find that being here, being treated as you treat me, with respect and honesty, it makes it easier to imagine forgiveness someday. If you had been cruel to me, I think my anger toward my father would only have grown. Instead—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish the thought, but Joseph seemed to understand regardless. "Instead, you have found some measure of peace," he said. "I am glad of it, Rebecca." It was around this time, nearly 2 months into their marriage, that Rebecca began to notice a shift in her own feelings toward her husband. What had begun as gratitude and cautious respect had, without her quite realizing when it happened, grown into something warmer. She found herself watching for his return each evening, feeling a small lift in her chest when she spotted him riding in from the range. She found herself laughing more easily at his dry humor, and found that she looked forward to their evening conversations on the porch with an eagerness that went beyond simple companionship. Joseph, for his part, had recognized his own growing affection for Rebecca weeks earlier, though he had said nothing of it, wary of pressing her before she was ready to hear such things. He admired her quiet strength, the way she had taken to ranch life despite having no prior experience with it, the sharp intelligence she brought to every conversation, and the tenderness she showed toward the small creatures of the ranch, the barn cats and the orphaned calves she sometimes helped bottle feed when their mothers had died in difficult births. It was a warm evening in early July when everything between them shifted decisively. Rebecca had been in the barn, checking on a calf that had taken ill, when a sudden summer storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing with it sharp cracks of thunder and a driving rain that seemed to come from nowhere. Joseph, caught out on the range checking fences, rode hard for home, worried for Rebecca's safety, and arrived soaked through to find her still in the barn, tending calmly to the sick calf despite the storm raging outside. "You should be in the house," Joseph said, dismounting quickly and hurrying into the barn's shelter, water streaming from his hat and coat. "The calf needed tending," Rebecca said simply. "I could not leave her suffering while I sat comfortably indoors." Joseph looked at her, illuminated by the single lantern hanging from a beam, her dress damp from where rain had blown in through the barn's open door, her hair coming loose from its pins, and felt something in his chest tighten with an emotion he could no longer deny. "Rebecca," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I must tell you something, and I hope you will not think less of me for the timing of it." "What is it?" she asked, looking up at him with those hazel eyes that had captivated him from the very first moment at the trading post. "I have fallen in love with you," Joseph said simply. "I did not expect it not so soon, and I know our marriage began under strange circumstances, more contract than courtship. But these past 2 months, watching you make this ranch your home, watching your strength and your kindness, I find I cannot pretend otherwise any longer. I love you, Rebecca, and I would understand if you are not ready to hear such things, but I could not keep it from you any longer." Rebecca stood very still, the calf forgotten for the moment, the storm outside seeming suddenly distant and unimportant against the weight of Joseph's words. She had felt her own feelings growing for weeks now, had recognized the warmth in her chest whenever he was near, but she had not expected him to speak of love so plainly, nor had she expected the surge of joy that rose in her at his words. "Joseph," she said softly, "I have felt something growing in me as well, these past weeks. I did not know how to name it, or whether it was proper to feel such things so soon after our marriage began under such strange terms. But I believe I love you too." Joseph's breath caught, and before either of them quite knew how it happened, he had crossed the small distance between them and taken her face gently in his rain-damp hands, searching her eyes for permission before he leaned down and kissed her, soft and reverent, as thunder rolled outside and the lantern light flickered warm against the barn's rough wooden walls. When they parted, Rebecca was smiling, truly smiling, in a way she had not done since long before her mother's death. "I did not expect to find love in a marriage born from such circumstances," she said. "Nor did I," Joseph agreed, "but I am endlessly grateful that I did." They returned to the house together that evening, laughing as they ran through the rain, and for the first time since their wedding, they shared a bed not merely out of duty but out of genuine desire, their love finally given full and honest expression after weeks of careful, growing affection. The following months brought their own challenges, as any life on the frontier inevitably did. The summer proved dry, and Joseph and Samuel worked long hours ensuring the cattle had access to what water remained, digging additional wells and driving the herd to graze along the river bottoms, where grass still grew green despite the lack of rain. Rebecca took to helping where she could, learning to ride well enough to assist with moving smaller groups of cattle, and continuing to manage the household with the same quiet competence she had shown from the beginning. It was in August, during the peak of the dry season stress on the ranch, that trouble arrived in a form neither Joseph nor Rebecca had anticipated. Horace Prout had not forgotten the humiliation of that day at Colton's trading post, nor had he forgotten the loss of his bull, which Elias Maddox had ultimately been forced to return under threat of legal action, a return that had further devastated the already struggling Maddox homestead. Prout, it seemed, was a man who nursed grievances carefully, waiting for opportunities to settle scores, and word had reached him, through the gossip networks that traveled between ranches and trading posts across the territory, that Joseph Ralston's herd was struggling with the summer drought, that the Circle R's finances, while sound, were not limitless, and that a well-timed offer or threat might yet allow Prout to claim some measure of revenge. He arrived at the Circle R on a hot afternoon in mid-August, accompanied by 2 hired men who looked more suited to trouble than honest ranch work, their holsters worn low, and their expressions carrying the particular blankness of men paid to intimidate rather than think. Rebecca was in the garden when she spotted the riders approaching, and something in the set of the lead rider's shoulders sent a cold jolt of recognition through her even before she could clearly make out his face. She hurried into the house, calling for Joseph, who had been in the barn working on a broken piece of harness with Samuel. "Joseph," she said, breathless, "it is Prout. He is coming, and he has brought men with him." Joseph's face darkened immediately. He set down the harness and moved quickly to retrieve his own pistol from where it hung near the door, though he did not put it on immediately, hoping the confrontation might be resolved without resorting to weapons. "Samuel," he said, "stay near, but let me speak with him first." By the time Prout and his men reined in before the ranch house, Joseph stood on the porch, Rebecca just behind him, her chin lifted in the same defiant posture she had shown that day at the trading post months before. "Ralston," Prout said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I have come to discuss a debt owed to me." "You are owed nothing here," Joseph said evenly. "The bull was returned to you as agreed after Elias Maddox honored his obligation." "The bull," Prout said. "Yes, I have it back, though it is hardly compensation for the humiliation you visited upon me that day, tearing up a legal contract in front of witnesses, making me appear the fool. I have thought long on how to settle that particular debt, Ralston, and I believe I have found a fitting solution." "And what might that be?" Joseph asked, though his voice carried a warning edge now. "Your ranch sits on some of the finest grazing land in this territory," Prout said. "Water rights along the river, good grass even in dry years like this one. I am prepared to offer you a fair price for it, more than fair, in fact, generous enough that you and your wife could relocate somewhere else entirely, start fresh." "This ranch is not for sale," Joseph said. "Not to you, not to anyone. I have built this with my own hands, and I intend to keep it." Prout's expression hardened. "I feared you might say as much. Understand, Ralston, that I am a patient man, but not an infinitely patient one. This drought will only worsen before it improves, and a ranch struggling with dry wells and thinning herds may find itself more amenable to my offer before winter arrives. I would suggest you reconsider, and reconsider quickly, before circumstances force your hand regardless of your current stubbornness." "Is that a threat, Prout?" Joseph asked, his voice low and dangerous now. "It is a prediction," Prout said, smiling thinly, "based on considerable experience with ranches that find themselves suddenly beset by difficulties, fences that mysteriously fall into disrepair, water sources that become contaminated, cattle that wander off in the night, never to be recovered. Such things happen out here in this wild country, particularly to ranches whose owners have made enemies of the wrong men." Rebecca felt a cold fury rising in her at these barely veiled threats, and she stepped forward before Joseph could respond, unable to hold her tongue any longer. You would resort to sabotage and theft simply to settle a petty grievance over a torn contract, she said. You are the same man who thought to buy a wife as though she were property, Mr. Prout, and it seems your character has not improved in the months since. Prout's eyes flickered toward her, cold and assessing. The girl still has fire, I see. A pity Ralston claimed you before I could reconsider my own offer, though perhaps it is for the best. I have little patience for wives who speak out of turn. She is not your concern and never will be, Joseph said, stepping slightly in front of Rebecca, his hand moving to rest meaningfully near his holster. I will say this once, Prout. If you or your men so much as touch a fence post on this property, if a single head of cattle goes missing, if anything at all happens to disadvantage this ranch that can be traced back to your influence, I will see you brought before a judge for it, and I will not hesitate to defend what is mine by whatever means necessary. Do you understand me? For a moment, the tension stretched taut between the two men, Prout's hired guns shifting slightly in their saddles, clearly gauging whether violence might be imminent. But Prout, for all his bluster, was not a man inclined toward direct confrontation when the odds were uncertain, and he seemed to calculate that Joseph, standing firm and clearly unafraid, backed by whatever reputation he had built in the territory, was not worth the risk of an open conflict that might draw unwanted attention from the law. We shall see how firm your resolve remains come winter, Ralston, Prout said finally, turning his horse. The offer stands, should you reconsider. Though I suspect my patience will not extend indefinitely. He rode off with his men, leaving behind a heavy silence that lingered even after the sound of their horses had faded into the distance. He means to make trouble for us, Rebecca said, once they were alone again. I believe he does, Joseph agreed grimly. We will need to be careful, watch the fences and the herd more closely than usual. Samuel and I can take turns riding the perimeter at night, and I will send word to the sheriff in Cheyenne. Let him know of Prout's threats, so there is a record of it should anything happen. I'm not afraid of him, Rebecca said, though her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed some measure of the fear she was trying to suppress. Nor am I, Joseph said, but I would rather be cautious than careless, particularly with so much at stake now. He looked at her then, his expression softening. I could not bear it, Rebecca, if anything happened to you because of my stubbornness in refusing his offer. You would truly consider selling then? Rebecca asked, surprised. After everything you have built here? No, Joseph said firmly. I would not sell, not to a man like Prout, not for any price. But I want you to know that if the danger became too great, if I believed your safety was truly threatened, I would reconsider everything, the ranch included. You matter more to me than any acreage, Rebecca. I need you to understand that. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. I understand, she said softly, and I want you to know that I do not wish for you to sacrifice everything you have built out of fear for me. We will face whatever comes together, Joseph. That is what a marriage should be, is it not? Facing hardship side by side, rather than one person bearing the burden alone. It is exactly that, Joseph agreed, pulling her into an embrace that felt like both comfort and promise. The weeks following Prout's visit passed with a heightened vigilance that gradually became routine. Samuel Coates, who had grown fond of Rebecca over the months and had come to view the young couple's happiness with something like paternal pride, took to riding the eastern boundary of the ranch each night, while Joseph covered the western reaches, both men watching for any sign of interference from Prout's hired men. No immediate trouble came, though the drought continued to worsen through late August and into September, forcing Joseph to make difficult decisions about which portions of the herd to sell early rather than risk losing them to the worsening conditions. It was a stressful time, financially precarious, but Rebecca found that facing these challenges alongside Joseph, rather than the isolated fear she had felt at her father's failing homestead, made even the hardship feel bearable, even meaningful. It was during this period that Rebecca discovered she was pregnant, a realization that brought both joy and a fresh layer of worry given the uncertain circumstances surrounding the ranch and Prute's lingering threats. She told Joseph one evening in late September as they sat together after supper and watched his face transform from mild curiosity at her nervous demeanor into pure, unguarded joy. "A child," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rebecca, this is wonderful news." "I worried you might think the timing poor," Rebecca admitted, "given everything with Prute and the drought and the uncertainty of it all." "There is never a perfect time for such news," Joseph said, taking her hands in his. "But I could not be happier, regardless of the circumstances surrounding us. We will face whatever comes, and our child will grow up on this land, strong and loved, no matter what challenges we must overcome to ensure it." The pregnancy proceeded through the autumn months without significant complication, though Rebecca found herself tiring more easily as the weeks progressed, and Joseph insisted she take on lighter duties around the ranch, much to her occasional frustration, as she had grown accustomed to the physical work and found idleness difficult to tolerate. It was in early November, as the first true cold of the coming winter began to settle over the territory, that Prute's threats finally manifested into action. Samuel discovered it first on his morning ride to check the herd, a section of fence along the northern boundary torn down and trampled, and nearly a dozen head of cattle missing, driven off in the night by unknown parties, though the tracks leading away from the ranch told a clear enough story to anyone familiar with the methods of cattle thieves. "It is Prute's work," Joseph said grimly, examining the damaged fence and the churned earth where the cattle had been driven through. "Or at least, men working at his direction. This is no random rustling, not this precisely targeted, not after everything he threatened." "What will you do?" Rebecca asked, worry etched across her face as she stood beside him, one hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her belly, now visibly showing her pregnancy at nearly 5 months along. "I will ride to Cheyenne," Joseph said, "and speak with Sheriff Halloway directly. I already informed him of Prute's threats back in August, and this theft gives us grounds for a formal investigation. Rustling is a serious crime in this territory, Rebecca, and if we can prove Prute's involvement, he will face real consequences, not merely social embarrassment." "I want to come with you," Rebecca said. "It is a long ride," Joseph said, concern immediately coloring his voice. "In your condition, I worry it might be too much strain." "I will not be left behind while you face this alone," Rebecca said firmly. "We agreed, Joseph, to face difficulties together. I am not so fragile that a ride to town will harm me or our child." Joseph looked at her for a long moment, recognizing the same stubborn strength that had first drawn him to her that day at the trading post, and knew arguing further would be futile and perhaps unnecessary regardless, given how well she had managed her pregnancy thus far. "Very well," he said. "We will ride together, but slowly, and you will tell me immediately if you feel unwell." They rode into Cheyenne the following day, Samuel remaining behind to watch over the remaining herd, and presented their case to Sheriff Halloway, a weathered man in his 50s who had kept the peace in the growing town for nearly a decade and had little patience for the sort of intimidation tactics Prute had employed. "I have had my own concerns about Prute for some time now," Halloway admitted, once Joseph had explained the situation in full detail, including the earlier threats made during Prute's visit to the Circle R. "He has a reputation for underhanded dealings, though he has always been careful enough to avoid direct evidence linking him to any wrongdoing. This rustling, if we can trace it back to him or his hired men, might finally give us grounds to act." "What would you need from us?" Joseph asked. "Physical evidence would help," Halloway said. "Tracks, any items left behind at the scene, anything that might connect the theft directly to Prute's ranch. I will ride out myself to examine the fence line and the tracks, and I will also make inquiries among the men known to work for Prute. See if any of them might be persuaded to speak honestly about recent activities, particularly if offered some leniency in exchange for testimony. True to his word, Sheriff Holloway rode out to the Circle R the following day, examining the scene of the theft with careful attention, and within a week, his investigation had turned up sufficient evidence, including testimony from one of Pruitt's own hired men who had grown uneasy with the increasingly aggressive tactics his employer favored, and had agreed to speak in exchange for avoiding prosecution himself, to bring formal charges against Horace Pruitt for cattle rustling and criminal threatening. Pruitt was arrested in late November, protesting his innocence loudly even as Sheriff Holloway led him away in irons, and the subsequent trial, held in Cheyenne before a territorial judge in early December, resulted in a conviction that saw Pruitt sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, his considerable landholdings seized to pay restitution to Joseph for the stolen cattle and damaged fencing, with the remainder distributed among several other ranchers who had apparently suffered similar, previously unreported incidents at Pruitt's hands over the preceding years. It seems your husband's stubbornness in refusing to sell finally brought a measure of justice to more than just your own troubles, Sheriff Holloway remarked to Rebecca after the trial had concluded and Pruitt had been led away to begin serving his sentence. There were at least 3 other ranching families who had suffered similar intimidation, too frightened or lacking sufficient evidence to bring charges on their own. Your husband's willingness to stand firm and see this through properly has done this territory a genuine service. Rebecca felt a swell of pride at these words, watching Joseph accept the sheriff's gratitude with characteristic humility, deflecting credit toward Samuel's vigilance and the eventual testimony of Pruitt's own hired man, rather than claiming any particular heroism for himself. "We simply refuse to be bullied," Joseph said. "Any decent person would have done the same, given the circumstances." "Not everyone possesses such conviction when their own safety and livelihood are at stake," Holloway said. "You should be proud of what you have accomplished here, Mr. Ralston, Mrs. Ralston. Justice does not always come swiftly or completely in this territory, but in this case, I believe we have achieved something close to it." With Pruitt's threat finally and permanently resolved, Joseph and Rebecca returned to the Circle R with a lightness they had not felt in months, free at last from the constant vigilance and worry that had shadowed their autumn. The remaining weeks before winter's full arrival passed in relative peace, Joseph and Samuel working to repair the damaged fencing and secure the ranch against the coming cold, while Rebecca continued to prepare for the arrival of their child, sewing small garments and arranging the nursery that would occupy the room adjacent to their own bedroom. Winter arrived in earnest by mid-December, bringing heavy snows that blanketed the territory and made travel difficult, but the Circle R was well prepared, its stores of hay and grain sufficient to see the herd through the cold months, and its woodpile substantial enough to keep the ranch house warm despite the plummeting temperatures. It was during this quiet winter period, snowed in together with only occasional visits from Samuel, who maintained his own small cabin on the property, but joined them for meals when the weather permitted, that Joseph and Rebecca's relationship deepened further, their early affection having grown into something profound and unshakable through the trials they had faced together. "I think of that day at the trading post sometimes," Rebecca said one evening in late December as they sat together near the fireplace, the snow falling thick and silent outside the windows. "How different my life would have been had you not arrived when you did." "I think of it often as well," Joseph admitted. "Though I confess, at the time, I acted more from outrage at the injustice I witnessed than any grand plan for how things might unfold between us." "I am grateful for that outrage," Rebecca said, smiling. "Grateful you were the sort of man who could not simply ride past and ignore what was happening." "I could not have lived with myself, had I done so," Joseph said, "but I am equally grateful for how things have unfolded since. I did not expect when I offered marriage that day that I would come to love you so completely, Rebecca. I thought only to solve an immediate injustice. I did not anticipate finding the great happiness of my life in the process." "Nor did I," Rebecca said. "I came to this marriage expecting, at best, a tolerable arrangement, a roof over my head and safety from my father's desperate schemes. I never imagined I would find true love, true partnership, the kind of happiness I see reflected in your eyes each time you look at me." Joseph leaned forward and kissed her gently, the firelight casting warm shadows across the small room that had become, over the preceding months, truly their home rather than simply a shelter of convenience. "I love you, Rebecca Ralston," he said, using her married name deliberately, watching her face light up at the sound of it. "More than I ever thought possible, and more each day that passes." "I love you too, Joseph," she said, "completely and without reservation." Their daughter was born in late February, during a brief thaw that broke the harshest grip of winter, a healthy girl with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's dark hair, whom they named Charlotte after Joseph's mother who had passed so many years before. The birth had been long and difficult, attended by a midwife who traveled out from Cheyenne despite the still treacherous roads, but both mother and daughter emerged healthy and strong, and Joseph, who had paced anxiously outside the bedroom for the better part of 18 hours, wept openly with relief and joy when he was finally permitted to hold his newborn daughter for the first time. "She is perfect," he said, staring down at the small bundle in his arms with an expression of wonder that Rebecca, exhausted but glowing with happiness from the bed where she rested, found utterly endearing. "She has your nose," Rebecca said, smiling weakly. "And your eyes," Joseph replied, "which means she will grow up entirely too clever and far too strong-willed for her own father's peace of mind." "Good," Rebecca said. "The world needs more strong-willed women, particularly out here, where so many forces would seek to diminish us given the chance." Joseph carried Charlotte to the bed and placed her gently in Rebecca's arms, and the three of them remained together in that quiet room as the late winter light filtered through the window. A small family born from circumstances that had begun in cruelty and injustice, but had transformed, through Joseph's decency and Rebecca's resilience, into something beautiful and enduring. The following years brought their own share of challenges and joys, as life on the frontier inevitably did. The Circle R continued to grow and prosper, Joseph's careful management and Samuel's steady assistance allowing the ranch to expand its herds gradually, weathering the droughts and harsh winters that periodically tested the territory's ranchers. Rebecca, meanwhile, found herself increasingly respected within the small community that had grown up around Cheyenne, known for her skill with herbal remedies learned from her own mother. Skills she often shared with neighboring families when illness or injury required attention beyond what the territory's few doctors could readily provide. Elias Maddox, Rebecca's father, visited more frequently as the years passed, the wound between father and daughter gradually healing as he demonstrated, through consistent effort and genuine remorse, that he had truly reformed from the desperate man who had once considered trading his daughter for livestock. He doted on his granddaughter Charlotte with an affection that surprised even Rebecca, and eventually, when his own homestead finally failed entirely under the weight of accumulated debts and poor harvests, Joseph offered him a small cottage on the edge of the Circle R's property, along with modest work tending the ranch's smaller livestock. An offer of forgiveness and support that Elias accepted with tears of gratitude, recognizing it as far more generosity than he likely deserved given his past actions. "You have given me more than I could have hoped for," Elias told Joseph one evening, several years after that fateful day at the trading post, as they sat together on the porch watching Charlotte, now nearly 4 years old, chase fireflies in the summer twilight with her younger brother, a boy named Thomas who had been born 2 years after his sister, sharing his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination even at such a young age. "I do not know that I could have forgiven myself had you not shown Rebecca such kindness. You saved her from a fate I nearly consigned her to out of my own desperation and poor judgment." "We have all found our way to a good place in the end," Joseph said. "That is what matters now, not dwelling on past mistakes that cannot be changed, but building something worthwhile from where we currently stand." "You are a better man than I deserve as a son-in-law," Elias said. "And Rebecca could not have found a better husband, nor my grandchildren a better father." Rebecca, who had come out onto the porch in time to hear this exchange, smiled warmly at her father, the last vestiges of old anger having long since faded into genuine affection and forgiveness. "We have all grown, father," she said, settling beside Joseph and taking his hand. "That is what matters most." As the years continued to unfold, the Circle R became known throughout the territory not merely for its successful cattle operation, but for the Ralston family's reputation for fairness and generosity, qualities that had first drawn Joseph to intervene on Rebecca's behalf that day at the trading post, and which had only deepened through their years together. They took in occasional strays, both animal and human, offering work and shelter to travelers who found themselves in difficult circumstances, always remembering the grace that had been extended to them during their own most vulnerable moment. Samuel Coates remained with the ranch throughout these years, eventually marrying a widow from town named Martha Fenwick, and the two of them built their own small home on a corner of the Circle R's extensive property, remaining close friends and neighbors to Joseph and Rebecca even as their own family grew alongside the Ralstons. Charlotte grew into a bright, capable young woman, inheriting her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's steady determination, while Thomas developed into a skilled horseman by his early teens, often accompanying his father on cattle drives and learning the intricacies of ranch management with an enthusiasm that promised he would one day take over the Circle R's operations with the same care and dedication Joseph had shown throughout his own years of stewardship. A third child, a daughter named Emily, arrived some years later, in 1885, completing their family with a gentle, artistic spirit quite different from her older siblings, though no less beloved for her differences, finding her own passion in painting the landscapes surrounding their ranch, capturing on canvas the beauty that her parents had come to cherish so deeply over their years together. It was on a warm evening in the autumn of 1888, exactly 10 years after that fateful day at Colton's trading post, that Joseph and Rebecca found themselves once again sitting together on their porch, now considerably expanded and improved from the modest structure it had been in their first years of marriage, watching their 3 children play together in the golden light of a late September sunset. 10 years, Rebecca said softly, watching Thomas, now 12, teaching his younger sister Emily how to properly saddle a pony, while Charlotte, at 14, already showing the poise and confidence that would serve her well in whatever future she chose to pursue, read a book on the porch steps nearby. It hardly seems possible that so much time has passed since that terrible day. Terrible in its beginning, Joseph agreed, but leading to everything good that has followed. I do not regret how we came together, Rebecca, strange and frightening as that day was. It led us here to this life, these children, this happiness I could not have imagined possible before I met you. Nor could I, Rebecca said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they had done countless times over the preceding decade, the comfortable familiarity of their love having only deepened with the passage of years rather than fading as some might expect. I think often of how different everything might have been, had you not arrived at that trading post when you did, had you simply ridden past and left Prout to complete his transaction with my father. I could never have ridden past, Joseph said. Not witnessing such injustice, not even before I knew you, before I understood what a remarkable woman you would prove to be. You saw something in me that day, Rebecca said, before you truly knew me at all, enough to tear up a contract and offer marriage to a complete stranger. I saw your strength, Joseph said, your refusal to bend even when everyone around you expected submission. I did not know then that I would come to love you so deeply, but I recognized immediately that you deserved better than what Prout and even your own father were prepared to offer you. And you gave me better, Rebecca said. You gave me everything, Joseph. A home, a family, a life filled with genuine love rather than mere convenience or obligation. You gave me the same, Joseph replied. I was alone before you arrived, Rebecca, more isolated than I fully recognized until you filled this house with your presence, your laughter, eventually our children's voices as well. You transformed this ranch from a solitary man's project into a true home, a true family legacy that will continue long after we are gone, through Thomas and Charlotte and Emily, and whatever children they themselves might eventually raise. Rebecca smiled, watching her children continue their play in the fading light, Thomas now attempting to teach Emily a proper whistle to call the ponies. His efforts met with Emily's giggling failures and Charlotte's amused commentary from her position on the steps. I could not have imagined this life, Rebecca said. On that day at the trading post, standing in that corral, believing my future had been reduced to whatever misery Horace Prout intended for me. I felt then as though all hope had been extinguished, as though I had no control whatsoever over my own destiny. And now, Joseph asked, though he already knew her answer, had witnessed it reflected in her actions and her happiness throughout their years together. Now I understand that even in our darkest moments when everything seems lost, there remains the possibility of unexpected grace, Rebecca said. You were that grace for me, Joseph. You tore up a contract that would have condemned me to a lifetime of misery, and you offered instead a partnership built on genuine respect and, eventually, genuine love. I do not know how I could ever adequately thank you for what you did that day, nor for everything you have given me and our children in the years since. You have already thanked me, Joseph said, every single day, simply by being who you are, by loving me as fully and honestly as you have, by raising our children with such care and wisdom. I need no other thanks beyond the happiness we share together, Rebecca. He leaned down and kissed her then, gentle and lingering, as their children continued playing nearby, oblivious to their parents' quiet moment of reflection and reaffirmed love. And as the sun finally sank below the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that seemed to mirror the depth and warmth of the love that had grown between them over the preceding decade. That night, after the children had been put to bed, Rebecca and Joseph sat together once more, this time inside near the fireplace, the autumn evening having grown cool enough to warrant its comfort, and Rebecca found herself thinking again of her father, now elderly and increasingly frail, living peacefully in his small cottage on the edge of the Circle R's property, his relationship with his daughter and grandchildren having fully healed over the years into something genuinely warm and loving. I received a letter today, Rebecca said, from a cousin of my mother's living now in Denver. She wrote to inform me that Horace Prout passed away last month in the territorial prison of pneumonia contracted during a particularly harsh winter. Joseph was quiet for a moment, absorbing this news. How do you feel learning of it? Rebecca considered the question seriously before answering. I feel little, honestly, not satisfaction at his suffering, nor particular grief at his passing. He caused genuine harm to us and to others in this territory, and he paid a price for that harm through his imprisonment. His death simply feels like the closing of a chapter that had already been resolved years ago, when justice was properly served through the courts. That seems a healthy way to view it, Joseph said. I confess I feel similarly. He no longer holds any power over our lives, nor has he for many years now. His passing changes nothing about the life we have built together, nor does it diminish the happiness we have found. No, Rebecca agreed, it does not. If anything, it simply reminds me how fortunate we have been, how different everything might have unfolded had you not intervened that day, had Prout's cruelty been allowed to proceed unchecked. We were fortunate, Joseph agreed, though I believe fortune alone does not account for everything. You possess the strength to stand firm even in your darkest moment, and that strength, more than any simple luck, shaped the course of everything that followed." Rebecca smiled at this, appreciating the way Joseph always seemed to recognize and validate her own agency in their shared story, refusing to let her be cast merely as a passive recipient of his rescue, but rather as an active participant in building the life they now shared. "We built this together," she said. "You and I, from that very first moment when I refused to simply accept the fate others had chosen for me, and you refused to stand idle while injustice was committed before your eyes." "Together," Joseph agreed, pulling her close against him as the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. "Now, and for however many years we might yet be granted together." "I intend for it to be many years," Rebecca said, smiling against his shoulder. "I have grown rather accustomed to this life, Joseph Ralston, and I do not intend to relinquish it easily." "Nor do I intend to relinquish you," Joseph said. "Not now, not ever. You are the great fortune of my life, Rebecca, and I will spend whatever years remain to us continuing to prove myself worthy of the love you have given me." "You proved that worthiness the moment you tore up that contract," Rebecca said, "and you have continued proving it every single day since. I have never doubted your worth, Joseph, not for a single moment of our marriage." They remained together by the fire late into that autumn evening, speaking of their children's futures, of plans for expanding the ranch further in coming years, of the small joys and occasional worries that filled their daily life. And through it all, the underlying current of deep, abiding love that had grown from such an unlikely and frightening beginning remained steady and true. A testament to the possibility of finding genuine happiness, even from circumstances that had once seemed destined for only misery and injustice. Years continued to pass, each bringing its own mixture of challenges and blessings, as Charlotte grew into a young woman who eventually married a young rancher from a neighboring spread, a union built on genuine affection that echoed her parents' own love story, though without the dramatic circumstances that had characterized her mother's introduction to marriage. Thomas took increasing responsibility for the Circle R's daily operations as he grew into his own capable manhood, eventually marrying a schoolteacher from Cheyenne who brought her own gentle wisdom to the family. Emily continued developing her artistic talents, eventually finding some modest renown for her paintings of Wyoming's dramatic landscapes, several of which were displayed in a gallery in Denver that specialized in celebrating the beauty and history of the American West. Elias Maddox lived to see all three of his grandchildren reach adulthood, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, having spent his final years surrounded by the family he had once nearly destroyed through his own desperation, but with whom he had ultimately found genuine reconciliation and love. Rebecca grieved his passing deeply, but found comfort in knowing that the wounds of the past had been fully healed before his death, that he had died knowing himself forgiven and loved, rather than carrying the burden of his earlier cruelty into eternity. Samuel Coates and his wife Martha remained close friends and neighbors throughout the following decades, their own children growing up alongside the Ralston children, the bonds between the two families deepening with each passing year, until the distinction between blood relation and simple friendship became almost meaningless, so thoroughly had their lives intertwined. And through it all, Joseph and Rebecca Ralston continued to build their life together on the Circle R, their love only deepening with the passage of years, weathering whatever storms life presented, whether financial hardship during difficult seasons, occasional illness, or simply the natural challenges that came with raising children and managing an increasingly successful ranching operation. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898, surrounded by their now-grown children and their children's own young families, a joyful gathering that filled the Circle R's expanded ranch house with laughter and warmth that stood in stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had characterized Rebecca's life on that fateful day 2 decades earlier, when her father had nearly traded her for a prize bull. "Do you remember?" Rebecca asked Joseph that evening, as they stood together watching their grandchildren, Charlotte's 2 young sons and Thomas's infant daughter, play together on the lawn while the adults enjoyed food and conversation nearby. "How frightened I was that day, believing my entire future had been decided without my consent, that I would spend my life as property rather than as a person with genuine agency and worth." "I remember," Joseph said, "and I remember thinking, even in that first moment when I intervened, that I could not simply witness such injustice without acting, regardless of the personal cost or complication it might bring to my own life." "You could not have known then," Rebecca said, "that your simple act of decency would lead to 20 years of genuine happiness, to 3 children, to grandchildren, to a life so completely different from what either of us might have imagined that day." "No," Joseph agreed, "I could not have known, but I do not believe I need to have known in order for the action to have been correct." "Sometimes we simply must do what is right, Rebecca, without knowing where it might lead, trusting that decency and justice, pursued honestly, tend to lead toward good outcomes even when we cannot foresee the specific shape those outcomes might take." "You have always possessed that faith," Rebecca said, "that trust in the fundamental rightness of decent action, regardless of immediate consequence or personal risk. It is one of the qualities I love most about you, Joseph, and one that I hope our children have inherited from you as well." "They have inherited it from both of us," Joseph said, "your own strength and refusal to accept injustice combined with whatever small measure of decency I might claim to possess. Our children are shaped by both our characters, Rebecca, not merely mine alone." Rebecca smiled, watching Thomas lift his young daughter high into the air, the child squealing with delighted laughter, while Charlotte's sons continued their boisterous play nearby, and felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her, gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought Joseph Ralston riding into Colton's trading post at precisely the moment her future had hung in such desperate balance. "I love you, Joseph," she said, turning to face him directly, her hazel eyes, still bright and fierce despite the passage of 20 years, meeting his steady gray gaze with the same depth of feeling that had grown between them since that first stormy evening in the barn when they had both finally confessed their love. "I have loved you for 20 years now, and I find that love only continues to deepen with each passing year, rather than fading as some might expect." "I love you as well," Joseph said, "more completely than I ever believed myself capable of loving another person before I met you. You transformed my life that day, Rebecca, just as thoroughly as I transformed yours. We saved each other, in the end, from different forms of loneliness and injustice, and built something together far greater than either of us could have achieved alone." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent despite the 20 years that had passed since their first kiss in that storm-lashed barn, surrounded by their family, their friends, the life they had built together from such unlikely and frightening beginnings. And Rebecca felt, as she had felt so many times over the preceding decades, an overwhelming gratitude for the grace that had intervened on that terrible day, transforming what might have been a life of misery and subjugation into one of genuine partnership. Deep, abiding love, and the kind of happiness that few people, even in the most fortunate of circumstances, were ever privileged to experience so fully and completely. The Circle R Ranch continued to thrive in the years that followed, eventually passing to Thomas's stewardship as Joseph and Rebecca gradually stepped back from the daily demands of ranch management, content to spend their later years enjoying their grandchildren's company, tending Rebecca's now extensive garden, and reflecting, in quiet moments on their porch, on the remarkable journey that had brought them together from such an unpromising beginning to a lifetime of genuine, deep, and abiding love. They lived to see the dawn of a new century, celebrating their 22nd wedding anniversary in 1900 with the same joy and gratitude that had characterized every anniversary before it, surrounded by 3 children, their respective spouses, and a growing number of grandchildren who would carry forward the legacy of decency, strength, and love that Joseph and Rebecca had built together, a legacy that had begun, improbably enough, with a torn contract and a stranger's simple refusal to accept injustice, and had blossomed, over more than 2 decades, into one of the most enduring and genuine love stories the Wyoming Territory had ever witnessed, a testament to the possibility of finding profound happiness even from the darkest and most frightening of beginnings, so long as courage, decency, and genuine love were allowed to guide the path forward.